Well, good morning. Thank you for making the decision to come to church and worship today. It's great to have you, great to have your company, and I pray that it will be a blessing for you in making that decision. Just some introductory remarks before we wrap up the series. If you were to ask the average person what event in human history most radically impacted the world and whose consequences rippled through future generations, well, you might get answers like the Renaissance, the two world wars, the Holocaust, maybe, 9/11, and so on. Only a few, I suspect, would say the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But here we are, 2,000 years on, and still gathering here on this Easter weekend to remember the story of a man whose life and teachings changed the world forever. Jesus exploded onto the historical timeline in a seismic event off the Richter scale. He gave us a vision of reality that transcended the wisdom and knowledge and understanding of this world. He showed us what living in the kingdom of God looked like. And in his death and resurrection, he gave us hope beyond the grave, the hope that we might live again. And the impact of the life of this man, Jesus, still reverberates down into our day in precisely the way he predicted it would. In his radical acceptance of people, the staggering scope of his love, we see the life of a being who was definitely not of this world, a being that came from another world to ours. And it's him that we remember this Easter weekend. We're finishing up a series today titled Stories of the Cross, in which we've revisited the story of the cross, but along the way we've considered the stories of specific individuals whose lives intersected with God, with his story prior to the cross, and as we'll see again today, in the aftermath of the resurrection as well. I think deep down, all of us would like to live a life where we are more fully aware of God's presence, to sense that God is among us, to know how we might connect with him. But most of us have, at best, spiritual ebb and flow, moments where we feel close to God and yet moments where we are absolutely oblivious to his presence in our life. Even when you might be a person of faith and believe deeply, it's still so easy to forget God. Sometimes it's just the mundane things of life that make us lose our sense of God. Sometimes we forget about God just because we're busy. Sometimes we're pulled away from that reality because we go through crisis or disappointments, which make us wonder or doubt whether God is actually there or not. Our faith is tested in those moments. Some days God seems so far away, so distant. So please don't think that you're alone in experiencing moments like that. How do we live our lives in such a way that God remains real? And I want to consider today some of the steps that we can take to experience his presence more fully and become living proof that he is among us. And those thoughts grow out of the focus of this part of the series on that pivotal moment in his story here on earth, his resurrection. We're going to consider two episodes in the resurrection story, several individuals from which we have much to learn. It's significant in the events immediately following Christ's resurrection that the people whom he first appears to are those who actively seek him. I'd invite you to read along with me. It's found in John chapter 20. If you are going to use this Bible in the pocket in front of you, it's on page 933, and we're reading from John chapter 20. So page 933 or John chapter 20. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, please tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." What can we take away from Mary's place in the resurrection narrative that first Sunday morning? Well, Mary wanted to anoint the body of Jesus, and she was guided not by the desire to get something in return, not because she was under anybody's orders to do so. She was guided and motivated simply by her love for Jesus. The disciples didn't offer to do what she was going to do. You know, it's when you serve for service's sake, when you love for love's sake, when you're kind for kindness' sake, it's at times like those that God is more likely to show up in unexpected ways with unexpected blessings. He reaches out and he touches you. In Mary's case, you get to see miracles that you might otherwise have missed. You get to see God roll away stones perhaps, that may be covering doorways in your life that you're supposed to go through. And so I would suggest the first thing we can all do to experience the presence of God more fully, along the lines of what we see in Mary, is to consciously choose to pursue God with passion and commitment. Sorry. Grace, you might want to come down and just have a look at this. To pursue God with passion and commitment. Practice the spiritual disciplines, not because it is always convenient to do so, but because it's an invitation for God to show up. And this isn't about how often you pray or how long you read your Bible for. It's about personal conviction. A desire to connect with God for his own sake. Because every instinct tells you that it's only in him you will find answers that satisfy. And that was certainly the case for Mary. I'm going to extend this principle a little bit broader than that by looking at a second encounter in Luke chapter 24, or page 909. So page 909, Luke chapter 24. And we're looking at the section here on the road to Emmaus. On this occasion, Jesus chose to step into the most ordinary of moments. These two individuals, we don't know whether they're two male friends or husband and wife, but these two individuals are just walking along, having a very passionate and animated discussion, trying to make sense of their lives, trying to make sense of their beliefs, trying to make sense of all that is going on around them, and Jesus shows up. It's almost as if Jesus knows when people are engaged in deep spiritual conversation. Is it possible that when we are willing to have meaningful conversations about our lives, about belief, about meaning, that Jesus is willing to step into those moments and make his presence felt. Let's read through this encounter and draw some lessons from it. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see." He said to them, How foolish you are. How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us. It is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, he gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" A second principle, perhaps, in experiencing the presence of God is just to talk about him often. Not just to him, but about him. Do you talk about God much? What are your conversations mostly about? What occupies your mind most of the time? Those wanting to encounter the presence of God must answer such questions. It's the only way to keep the reality of God alive. Because if we're honest, most days are not full of astonishing miracles. We really need to learn how to encounter God in the everyday of life, where we are walking, where we are talking, for it is in those regular encounters that relationship is born. Thirdly, the kind of people that God seems to show up for are those who are postured towards hope, towards faith. They just naturally lean towards optimism and belief. It's so much easier to just be cynical and skeptical in life, isn't it? Because if we never take a stand on anything, we sort of insulate ourselves from humiliation or embarrassment. But it is the risk of faith that God seems to honour so much. It's better to have lived a life filled with hope rather than one that opts for despair as the only reality. It is better to live a life of faith than one that does not believe that the impossible may in fact be possible. And so we can say as the third point that God's presence God's presence is often experienced by those who are more inclined to be positive and hopeful. There was something about Cleopas and his companion. They were just inclined towards believing. Hope was still alive in their souls. Something deep within them wanted to believe that God was here, that God had not forsaken them. There was this openness in their hearts to the possibility that if God was involved, the impossible just might happen. One thing in this encounter on the road to Emmaus that Jesus seems intent to do, and that is to show the travellers that circumstances are not always what they seem. He explains to them, though their lives seem to have been turned upside down and the world seems to be out of control, that God has leveraged those circumstances for his own purposes. That as horrible and as upsetting as those events were, they were never outside the plans of Jesus. One way in which we become aware of the presence of God is by striving to see him in all the circumstances of our lives, no matter what they might be. Sometimes the very circumstances that God brings into our lives to draw us and move us towards him, when we do this, we allow them to become a barrier between us and God, to create distance. No matter how chaotic, random, or uncertain, it's in those moments that we need to stop, look at those circumstances and ask, what is God trying to do here? What is he trying to say to me? What might God be up to? There is no train wreck in your life from which God cannot salvage hope and a renewed sense of life's meaning. I love how this story opens by simply saying that two friends were walking and talking together. The life that God wants you to have cannot be lived in isolation, because God makes us to need each other. It's not coincidental that two are walking together, having a spiritual conversation, trying to figure out what Jesus means to them, because Jesus said that when two or three are gathered in his name, he is there in he is there in the midst. And so if you want to more fully experience the presence of God, you need to be in community with other believers. God created you and I for a relationship, not only to him, but to one another. And when we journey together and we do life together, it's amazing how deeper our experience of God becomes. For some of you, this church is a community. For others, maybe just a crowd. But to truly experience God here, it has to become a place where other people know your name and you know theirs. You know their story and they know yours. One final thing that we can take from this event on the road to Emmaus is our need of the Scriptures as a refuge, a place where hope is born anew, where purpose and meaning becomes clearer. It's interesting that just at the moment when Jesus could have revealed himself to his companions in a very dramatic fashion, where they could see the scars on his hands and on his feet, it's in that moment that Jesus actually points them back to the Scriptures, and he begins to unravel the Scriptures from Moses to the prophets and beyond. I don't know exactly what Jesus said to them, but it might be something that's continually prefaced by, don't you remember? Don't you remember? Don't you remember that God gave you a system of religion that was like a temple without a roof? Because only the Messiah could put the roof on. And there were prophets and priests, there were sacrifices and there were holy days. Don't you understand? They pointed forward to the great prophet, greater than Moses, to the greater priest than Melchizedek. Don't you remember? All those kings pointed forward to the real king. Don't you know the temple appointed to him, the one that would be torn down and in 3 days would be rebuilt? Don't you know the sacrifices pointed to him? Without the shedding of blood, there was to be no remission of sins. Don't you remember Joseph? He's down in the pit, in the prison, and he's resurrected out. Don't you remember that Jonah is down in the whale, but he's resurrected out after 3 days? Don't you remember how Daniel was sealed in a tomb with lions, with a stone rolled over the entrance, but at daybreak was raised up from the tomb alive? In Psalms 22, the cry of my God, how it goes on to say, and peace in the latter part of the psalm. In Isaiah, lamb to the slaughter, he will be cut off, yet he will prolong his days. Don't you remember any of this stuff? We need to revisit the scriptures continually to be inspired by the stories of the past, that he would have us remember and be persuaded by the wisdom of those who have gone before us. And it tells us something about the scriptures, that God has given us his word that he may speak into our souls, and if we are open to him, it is there that we might expect to find him. And so to experience the presence of God, we need to read the scriptures and allow them to speak into our lives and bring clarity and conviction. A book that came out several years ago that gives you instructions on what to do in the direst circumstances that you can imagine. It's called The Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. And this book has sold millions of copies, and it covers every kind of situation that you could possibly imagine. How to perform in an emergency tracheotomy. How to land a plane. How to respond if you jump out of a plane and the parachute doesn't open. How to jump from a bridge into a river. How to defeat a robot uprising. The funny thing about it is that it's actually written straight-faced. It actually is advice from experts in their fields. The best advice on what to do in these types of situations. But nobody buys the books for the actual advice. It's sold actually in humour sections in bookstores as kind of a joke. But then as you're browsing through the book, you'll come to a section of the book like this: How to Survive the Next Pandemic, or How to Survive a Rip. And all of a sudden, it's not funny anymore. How many hearts might not have been broken in recent times if people had just known what is in this book? It's meant to be humorous, and it is, until the scenario described actually happens. Then it's not funny. Then you'd give anything. It's life and death. As beautiful as the stories of the cross have been in this series, I wonder how many times we simply file them away only to dust them off again when life isn't funny anymore, when it's life and death. Certainly, that's how the world treats it. How tragic when we do the same. How much heartache could have been avoided in people's lives if they had taken more time to know what was in this book. If there is one thing that the story of Mary and the Emmaus Road episode teaches us this morning, it is that experiencing the presence of God in your own life and in the life of your family will not happen by accident. Just as Jesus makes as though he's going to travel on to the next town towards the close of the story, God often tests our openness to his presence in our life. He invites us into a conversation with him, but he always gives us the choice. In Revelation, he tells us, I'm standing at the door of your heart, standing at the door of your life, and I'm knocking. Is there room here for me? There is no door in the world that God is not powerful enough to kick open, but he respects your will. He honors your right to choose, because God, you see, is a gentleman. The door is a metaphor for you and for me and our hearts. The reality is that God is present all around us, but that doesn't mean that he is within us or that we are within him. And for us to live a life in the presence of God, you have to decide to open yourself to him. And it's my prayer that this will be your heart's desire this morning. Invite the band to come up and lead us.